إن الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله أما بعد. I greet you all with the Islamic greetings of peace. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. First and foremost, I'd like to thank the brothers and the sisters and the friends who have organized this event today. Also, I'd like to thank all of you here for attending. Many of you, which is very good. Many colors, genders, peoples, which I think is very important. And this ties in with the Qur'an itself, which is the book of the Muslims. Because the Qur'an says, I have created you to different tribes and nations from a male and a female in order that you may know one another. Sometimes before I converted to Islam, I come from a Greek heritage, although I look Pakistani, but I do have Greek DNA somewhere. I don't know why everyone laughs when I say that. Maybe because they think I'm lying. But I brought my passport today specifically just to show you. So the point I'm trying to make is I used to say, why does it say for us to know one another and not to love one another or build ties with one another, etc. I think it's because knowledge is the basis for all of these things. And that's why it's very important for us today to transcend the hype and go beyond the rhetoric. It's essential for us to do this. Because we have the likes of Fox News, sometimes Sky News, the tabloids, certain political opportunists, which are usually politicians themselves, who like to throw around words such as extremism, terrorism, Islamism, Islamist, terrorist. And these words, I think they're not appropriate. And the brother mentioned yesterday, it was official that the government, via the Home Office, produced, which you can find on their website, Contest 2, which is essentially saying, if anyone does not agree with our values, which are specific to the Labour Party, by the way, and not the whole country, because when you go up and down the country, everyone has generally different values based upon their own heritage. If you don't believe me, just go to Scotland, or go to Wales, and you find out what they may think about certain values. So everyone is different, and I think this difference is good. There's nothing wrong with it. But the government, in my opinion, and I'm not trying to have a position here of ideological rhetoric, rather I want to transcend the hype. But I believe the government here is performing what you would call a contemporary inquisition. The liberal inquisition, if you like. If you don't believe in our values or thoughts, therefore you're not one of us. You're an extremist. And they use heavy words like the Shariah or Islamic law. If you believe in these things, you believe in these values, therefore you're not part of society, or you should be marginalized. You're an extremist. Forget about debate and dialogue. And that's why I applaud the people who have come here today, and I applaud the organizers for bringing a platform together so we can discuss and have a nuanced discussion on these issues, which we seldom have. Hence, I think it's a very important discussion, and I congratulate all of you for attending today. So today's topic is on Islamic law, barbaric or misunderstood. It's a question, and hopefully this question will be answered in my conclusion or during the question and answer sessions, which I think is very important that we must have, and I'm delighted that it's quite lengthy. We have been allocated an hour for this. Again, in accordance with the Islamic tradition, a prophetic hadith, which is a narration attributed to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace and blessings be upon him. He said, the cure to ignorance is to ask and learn. And I think in this light, we should all proceed. Islamic law for the Muslims is known as the Shariah. The word Shariah means a road to be followed. Linguistically, it means a path to a watering place, or a path to water. Now, the Sharia is the Islamic legal framework based upon, generally that is, the Qur'an and the Sunnah. The Qur'an is the book of the Muslims, the book that Muslims believe is from the divine. It is approximately 114 chapters, approximately over 6,000 verses, of which over 500 of them directly indicate to legal rulings such as law pertaining to areas of divorce, marriage, foreign policy, economics, etc. And this Shariah, the term, is mentioned in the Qur'an itself. The Qur'an says, ثُمَّ جَعَلْنَاكَ عَلَى شَرِيَّةٍ, which basically in English means, then we placed you on the right road, the Shariah, the path that Muslims are commanded to follow. And I believe its primary objective is justice. Just like many legal frameworks, whether they're Islamic, liberal, non-liberal, I believe Muslims and non-Muslims have an intuition, and this intuition is this sense of fair play, this sense of justice. We all feel it, we all know it, and I believe we all have it. But I think the Qur'an and the Quranic framework consolidates this intuition, this feeling. For example, the Qur'an says, قُلْ أَمْرَ رَبِّي بِالْقِسْطِ, say, my Lord has commanded justice. Also the Qur'an says, إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَأْمُرُ بِالْعَدْلِ, indeed, unquestionably, verily, God commands justice. And it's one of God's attributes in the Qur'an, al-adl, which basically means the just. It's one of His attributes. His essence is justice. So we as Muslims, not only are we commanded to follow and implement justice, but we believe our Lord, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is just Himself. Now before we start, I like to set the correct approach today. What we have to understand is we cannot superimpose our heritage, our beliefs, our values on something that is alien to it. For example, if we were to approach the Bible, for example, and I am a Muslim, and I approach the Bible with my Islamic baggage, if you like, my emotional and intellectual frame of reference, my hermeneutics, if I were to refer to that to understand the Bible, I believe that will not do the Bible justice. Because you must let each tradition, whether it's religious, spiritual, political, ideological, to speak for itself in its correct context. It is essential we do this. That's why we must transcend things like the terms barbarian or barbaric. I'll tell you why. If we were to take a law from the Islamic tradition and apply it in a liberal context, I would even call it barbaric or unjust, because it's gone outside of its context. I'll give you an example with a diagram. Now, in the following diagram, you see I'm trying to represent what a society is. Generally, a society has an ideology or political outlook or political philosophy with political values. Some of these may be justice, freedom, independence, etc. These values are propagated. Now, if anyone studies law or the history of law, you would understand that the development of law was based upon values. People can't legislate something if society is totally against it and it's not based upon the fundamental values of a particular society. And then on top of that, you have punishments in order to enact law. So there's a dynamic approach today, and there must be. We're not just going to talk about law. Because if we just do that, we're going to use our frame of reference and superimpose it on Islamic law. I think this is the wrong way forward. People of Islamic persuasion do this. People of liberal persuasion also do this also. But I think this is incorrect. Now is the time to understand each tradition in its own context, how it links with its values, with its political outlook. And in that way, we will be able to understand what truly is Islamic law and what truly is Western law and how it's applied in society. Now I'm going to do it in the following way. I have to compare like with like. So I'm going to compare the liberal social model with the Islamic social model. And within that, you're going to have political outlook, philosophical premise, law, values, and all the other discussions related to that. So we could get a clear picture on what Islam is trying to say with regards to society and what the liberal model is trying to say. And from that we'll do a comparison. Obviously, I'm going to have my own biases. I admit that from now. I'm going to look at the liberal model in a very, if you like, ideological manner. But I'm setting the premise now so you understand in the Q&A, there has been a deliberate attempt to look at the liberal model in that negative manner. Because one, I believe I have some justification for it. And second, we live in a post-liberal society where most of the Western world is governed by the disputatious doctrine called liberalism. And it's never questioned. That's why when you see legislators or politicians talk about how to solve social problems, they never go back to the values and say, maybe something's wrong with our underlying values. What they would do is say, we need more legislation. But there's a problem here, because when they look at so-called Muslim or Islamic societies, they straight away blame Islamic values. So why don't they do exactly the same thing with the problems that we face in our Britain? So my discussion is as follows. I'm going to define liberalism using Western philosophers. I'm going to discuss the premise of liberalism. I'm also going to discuss the link between liberal values and society's behavior, or any value and society's behavior, whether it's liberal or illiberal. Because there needs to be a link. We need to establish that there's actually a link between propagated values and the behavior of a society. I'm going to use some social research to justify and substantiate that claim. Then I'm going to discuss Islam's view on society, then discuss Islamic cohesive values, then the effect of the Islamic values on society itself. And I'm specifically only going to talk about history, because I believe the Islamic social model was only comprehensively implemented in the past. It's not being implemented today. For example, if we see Saudi Arabia and we scratch the intellectual surface, what we would realize is that it is a cocktail of different political philosophies, and I would argue it ranges from liberal economic theory to forms of fascism rather. Finally, I'm going to show how the Islamic model, I believe, is slightly more comprehensive and more workable than the liberal social model. And I think this is going to not only raise the intellectual temperature, but obviously facilitate the correct ground so we can have a very good Q&A. And don't worry, I'm a friendly guy. And I hope you are too. So let's define liberalism first. What is liberalism? Now, liberalism is the most predominant ideology. And if you read the works of Professor Shariah in his new book, The Liberal Project and Human Rights, he says, liberal states must recognize that the liberal project for world order is unavoidably a long-term one, which they need to pursue with patience and persistence, and not to be seduced by tempting shortcuts. Now from this we understand that liberalism is established, and it wants to, in a way, impose itself to establish world order. Now let's find out what liberalism actually is. Well, according to the Oxford Concise Dictionary of Politics, it says, liberalism is the belief or the aim of politics to preserve individual rights and maximize freedom of choice. Similarly, Professor of Philosophy Will Kimlicka, he confirms the bedrock of liberal thought. He says, liberals base their theories on notions of individual rights and personal freedom. That's fine. That sounds quite intuitive to me. That's amazing. We want to give people rights. However, when we scratch the intellectual surface, we find that these, if you like, political values are based upon a certain outlook. And I would argue that outlook is atomism or individualism. For example, the political philosopher and the well-known feminist, Marilyn Friedman, she adds, individualism underlies some important versions of liberal political theory. However, there's a problem here. If liberalism is based upon this premise of atomism or individualism, then why aren't we questioning individualism as a premise? Similar questioning is announced and exclaimed by the famous political philosopher Charles Taylor. He states, The very idea of starting an argument whose foundation was the rights of the individual would have seemed strange and puzzling. Why do we begin to find it reasonable to start a political theory with an assertion of individual rights and to give these primacy? The answer to this question lies in the hold on us of what I have called atomism. In other words, individualism. But brothers, sisters and friends, is individualism a correct premise to base any political outlook? I would strongly argue that is not the case for the following reasons. 1. There are social and communal attachments which define who we are. Because individualism, it seeks to dissociate the self as an abstract entity away from any social attachments. This is what individualism does. It seeks to understand the human being, the self, the individual, as an abstract entity away from social obligations and attachments. And I would argue there are social obligations and attachments or social links that define who we are. If anyone studies developmental psychology, you would see that the trend is going away from the Piaget theory of the individual constructor, which basically means during the early ages of cognitive development, you have the child, and the child learns by his or herself on their own. But more modern psychological developmental studies have shown that the child is no longer the individual constructor, but rather the child learns via social practices and social links. Second, aims and values must be considered when determining the individual, and aims and values can only be truly understood in a social context. Shlomo Avineri and Avner de Shalit argue this point, and they say, we cannot analyze their behavior as if they were abstract entities, as if their values existed somewhere in the distance, outside, so to speak. This is a critique of the image of a person put forward by the individualists, in other words, the liberals, who tend to distinguish between the one who is and the values one has. Third, there are dynamic links that determine who we are and shape our behavior between ourselves and society. If anyone is familiar with social constructionism and the famous author Vivian Burr, we will be very quick to come to this conclusion. And she gives an example of a capitalist society. She says, in a capitalist society, competition is fundamental. Society is structured around individuals and organizations that compete with each other for jobs, markets, etc. So where competition is a fundamental feature of social and economic life, what you would get is competitive people. So I would argue that individualism or atomism as a premise for liberal theory or the liberal outlook is completely incorrect for these very reasons. And I would also argue that these values are non-cohesive values. This is a very important word today. These values, or this value, or this premise of individualism is non-cohesive. What I mean by non-cohesive is that it doesn't evoke positive behaviors and it doesn't bring people together. Now let's see how values actually do affect society. Now I think this lies in the social theory of conformity. And there's two types of conformity. One is called informational social influence, and it's a type of conformity based upon our need for certainty. Everyone wants to be certain. We don't want to be unsure about everything. So according to very basic social theory or theory on conformity, you have the following model. You have the need to be certain, then you have subjective uncertainty, and that requires you to reduce that uncertainty to become more certain. So you would naturally compare yourself with others or the social norm in society, and then you have this process called internalization, which basically means you accept that social norm as your own idea now, and you would act upon it publicly and privately. Anyone can find this in the basic university textbook, The Science of the Mind and Behavior. Then we have another model of conformity called normative social influence, which is a type of conformity that leads to an individual's compliance in order to be liked. But it doesn't mean that we'll comply at home. Rather, we will only comply in a society. Nevertheless, the social norm can still affect our social behaviors. And as you can see, we have a need to be accepted and approved by others. Now, the power of the others, or in other words, society, to punish shapes our behavior. But what I mean by punish is not someone carrying a sword. Rather, it could be peer pressure, or marginalization, or belittlement. This could be a form of punishment. And we've seen this, I would argue, happening to the Muslim community by the likes of the Rupert Murdoch machine. So there will be a conflict between one owns opinions and the social norm or the opinions of others. Then there will be a compliance because the other or the social norm has more strength because it has the ability to punish via means of peer pressure and marginalization, etc. Therefore, you'd have private disagreement, but you'd have public acceptance. So there is a link, according to modern social research, between social norms, society's values, and the behavior of that society. Now, if then you propagate non-cohesive values, such as individualism and atomism, which is the premise of liberalism, then what are you going to get? You're going to get non-cohesive people. As they say in the IT industry, when they develop databases, you put rubbish data in, you're going to get rubbish out. Similarly, in a society, you put rubbish in, i.e. a non-cohesive value like individualism, you're going to get an individualistic society. And I would argue strongly that these predominant, propagated, non-cohesive values have caused social breakdown. And I'm not just saying this. In February 2009, just last month, the Children's Society launched a report, and it was called A Good Childhood, Searching for Values in a Competitive Age. And it reported certain statistics and conclusions that actually support my thesis today. It says, Britain and the US have more broken families than other countries, and our families are less cohesive in the way they live and eat together. British children are rougher with each other and live more riskily in terms of alcohol, drugs, and teenage pregnancy, and they are less inclined to stay in education. This comes against a background of much greater income inequality. Many more children live in relative poverty in Britain and the US. But what's even more fascinating is this report on page 8 actually says that this has happened because of what? Excessive individualism. It says, but we believe there is one common theme that links all of these problems: excessive individualism. Now let's talk in detail about some of these problems that has led to social breakdown. Child abuse. We all heard of the 17 months of torture and agony inflicted upon baby P. Baby P was found dead after months of torture with a broken back and broken ribs. In the UK, according to the NSPCC, 7% of children experience serious physical abuse at the hands of their parents or carers during childhood. In the US, an estimated 3.6 million children were accepted by state and local protection services as alleged victims of child maltreatment for investigation or assessment. 64.1% of these, of substantiated cases, were victims of neglect, whereas 16% of them suffered from physical abuse. And an average 4 children die each day in America as a result of this abuse. And it doesn't stop at children. What about the treatment of women? Well, according to Amnesty International UK, 167 women are raped every day in the UK. Let's do our maths here. That's over 60,000 rapes a year. Domestic violence accounts for nearly a quarter of all recorded violent crime in England and Wales. That's one incident of domestic violence reported to the police every minute. I think what's more fascinating here is 74% of men would report a dog being beaten to the RSPCA to the police, but only 53% would report a woman being beaten to the police. And the UK is not alone in the maltreatment of women. In the US, a woman is raped every 6 minutes and battered every 15 seconds. And let's look at the crime in the UK. The effect of liberalism's non-cohesive values of individualism or atomism has created an individualistic society. And this has led to over 2 million violent incidences in 2007 to 2008. And approximately, well, according to this source, 47,000 rapes a year. And there's been increase in murder rates also. Now, according to US bodies, they say that there's over 16,000 murders a year. And 9,000 of those murders are done with firearms. There's over 2 million prisoners, and this has increased even more since 2002. And America, astonishingly, has around 100,000 rapes a year. And in total, it's approximately 12 million crimes each year in the US. So this is the result of the liberal outlook, I would argue, based on the premise of individualism. And we have established that a non-cohesive value propagated in a society, which we have shown via social research, you will get a non-cohesive society, which I believe the reports and the stats actually conclude what I'm saying. Let's talk about the Islamic perspective almost. Although, I did say I'm going to be slightly have ideological undertones with this, so I'm going to create a very positive picture, but I think the Q&A should actually try and challenge me on my claims. And I'm willing to be challenged. I think that's what we should be doing, having this type of discussion. But I believe Islam's philosophy on society is very unique. It's not the liberal model where you crush society, neglect society, and you make the individual sovereign. And it's unlike the communist society where you forget about the individual and you say, let's make society sovereign. I think it acquires that unique balance that's needed in contemporary society. And this is best described in the following hadith. And a hadith is a narration attributed to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace and blessings be upon him. And the hadith is as follows. God's messenger gave an example of people sailing on a boat, having an upper deck and a lower deck. The people from the lower deck require water and request water from the people of the upper deck. The people from the upper deck refuse to give water, so the people from the lower deck decide to make a hole in the floor to get water from the sea. God's messenger said, if the people from the upper deck don't stop the people at the bottom from making a hole, the ship will sink and all the people will drown. Now I believe this indicates to us that there must be a symbiotic relationship, a positive relationship between the individual and society and the individual. It also tells us that certain needs of individuals must be placed in the context of society's needs, and society's needs must also be placed in the context of individual needs. It's not one or the other. And as a result, I believe the Shariah Islamic law, the Islamic legal framework, seeks to propagate cohesive values. And we said cohesive values are values that bring people together or evoke positive behaviors. And some of these cohesive values are propagated via the source text of the Sharia, which I mentioned in the beginning, is the Qur'an, the book of the Muslims, and the Sunnah or the Hadith, the narrations attributed to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. For example, we find one hadith found in Abu Dawood, and it says, the best of all jihad is a word of truth to a tyrant ruler. Accountability here. Also in the Qur'an it says, let there be among you people that command the good enjoying what is right and forbidding the wrong. They indeed are the successful. And it also says, judge with justice between them. Indeed, God loves those who are just. And it also says, with regards to compassion and kindness, what would explain to you what the steep path is? It is to free a slave, to feed at a time of hunger an orphan relative or poor person in distress, and to be one of those who believe and urge one another to steadfastness and compassion. And one of my favorite verses in the Qur'an, it says, bear witnesses impartially for justice, and do not let the hatred of others make you swerve for justice, but adhere to justice, for that is closer to the consciousness of God. And before I go into how it's positively affected societies in the past, let me give you what a Jewish historian said about the Islamic cohesive values in history. Amnon Cohen, an American Jewish historian, he studied 16th century documents which found 1,000 Jewish cases filed from the year 1530 to 1601. And he says the following unprecedented and usually unknown statement. Cases concerning Jews cover a very wide spectrum of topics. If we bear in mind that the Jews of Jerusalem had their own separate courts, the number of cases brought to the Muslim court, which actually meant putting themselves at the mercy of a judge outside the pale of the communal and religious identity, is quite impressive. The Jews went to the Muslim court for a variety of reasons, but the overwhelming fact was their ongoing and almost permanent presence there. This indicates that they went there not only in search of justice, but did so hoping, or rather knowing, that more often than not, they would attain redress when wronged. To put it into plain English, the majority of the Jews in the 16th and 17th century decided willingly to go to the Qadi, which is the Islamic judge, rather than their rabbinical courts. Something which I believe is unprecedented, and I believe is as a result of the propagated cohesive values such as justice in the Islamic social model. Now let's discuss the social models now. This is where it gets a bit interesting. Now we have already discussed the premise of liberalism is individualism or atomism, and we've concluded that it's a non-cohesive value. It doesn't create positive behaviors, doesn't bring people together. Also, intuitively, we know that these values are propagated. We see this in the media. For example, anyone who was to hear last year's lecture or speech by David Cameron at one of the defense forums, he mentioned liberal values over 5 times as an example. So politicians and influentials seek to propagate these non-cohesive values. Now I would also argue that there is no mechanisms in place in a liberal society to prevent crime. What do I mean by this? Well, I'm going to substantiate what I'm saying a bit further when I discuss the Islamic social model. But what I mean is that it's left very open. Clive Hollin, a very famous criminal psychologist, he says, if crimes are done usually for financial gain, then why don't we look at the situation that facilitates that kind of behavior? For example, in the liberal economic model, we know is based on a geopolitical myth. Frankly, I think it's a joke, and it's one of the features or one of the reasons for the financial crisis. And what is this geopolitical myth? Too many needs, not enough resources. And from this myth, it has created the concept of competition, competing for goods, and creating very competitive behaviors. Not cohesive behaviors, but competitive behaviors. Hence, goods and competition is seen as the yardstick. And we could see this on the media, and the effect this has on teenagers and young children in society. People think people are good because they have the new mobile phone, or the BMW, or they look like David Beckham, or whoever the next best football player is. So I think you understand my point here. There is no mechanisms to actually prevent crime. Rather, I think it's the opposite. A liberal society facilitates these types of crime because it agitates certain behaviors. You may think this is incorrect, but if we even go to liberal think tanks like the RAND report, the RAND think tank, they developed a report and they said there's a direct correlation between sexual activity on television and teenage pregnancies. Statistically valid correlation. So why aren't we doing something about these agitations of our instincts, if you like, that produce effects that we do not like, such as crime? And on top of this, I would argue that in the liberal model there's a weak justice system and inappropriate punishments. I mean, for incest or rape, someone just gets 1 year or 2 years. And in the judicial system, that actually means only being in prison for 6 months. So they take him usually from his flat in Hackney, in one of the ghettos in London, and take him to his relative posh flat in one of the prisons. This is problematic. No wonder prisoners want to go back all the time. But I'm not just saying this. Nick Davies, an investigative journalist working for The Guardian, he spent 2 years investigating a badly flawed criminal justice system. And he came up with the following results. The justice system is bringing justice to only 3% of offences committed. 3%. Punishment is not changing the behavior of repeat offenders. Weak punishment. The courts are still not equipped with powers to attack the problems which generate crime, with the result that they continue to send too many defendants to custody. Courts continue to experience severe delays. 24% of prisoners are not delivered to court on time. 52% of civilian witnesses come to court and do not give any evidence. 44% of fines are unpaid. Up to 40% of community punishments are unserved. This is the reality of modern day criminal justice system. There is no wonder that the statistics that I quoted to you earlier are actually a reality. Now let's look at the Islamic social model. We've discussed Islam has a very unique view on society. It says there must be a symbiotic relationship between the individual and society the society and the individual. Hence, it has an anti-individualistic outlook, anti-egotistic outlook, and it seeks to propagate cohesive values such as justice, mercy, distribution of resources, etc. Now this doesn't mean that liberals or people in a liberal society don't have these values. Of course they do. But the issue is, in an Islamic social model, it wouldn't create the unnecessary competition with non-cohesive values, and it wouldn't solely make the non-cohesive values as the main fundamental feature of its society. And also, I would argue that in the Islamic social model, it has mechanisms in place to prevent crime. For example, I spoke to you about Clive Hollin, a criminal psychologist, and when he discusses that we should look at the situation that evokes crime rather than just look at the behavior of the criminal. And I discuss the liberal economic model which facilitates competition and an unnecessary, if you like, greed and the advancement to continually acquire goods, sometimes unnecessarily. In the Islamic model, there isn't that over-agitation of, if you like, the survival instinct, if you want to put it in those terms. Because the Islamic economic model that sits within the social model, if you like, is not based upon a geopolitical myth. It's based upon a reality that there are limited essential needs and enough resources. So the problem here is solved. The major economic problem, which is distribution of wealth. And this is according to the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that the son of Adam, i.e. the human being, has right to food, shelter and clothing. So the Islamic social model, or the Islamic society, seeks to distribute wealth so everyone could have that as a basis, as a basic, and from there the society grows and it establishes economic activity, which if we want to discuss the Islamic economic model, we can do so further. But my point here is that because this Islamic social model is linked to other models that are quite unique and that do not facilitate unnecessary competition and greed, therefore, and according to Clive Holland, a leading criminologist, the situation is removed now that facilitates certain crimes. And finally, on top of that, I would argue there is a strong justice system and suitably harsh punishments, which are known as the hudud in the Arabic or Islamic terminology. Now let's firstly discuss the strong justice system. We've already indicated what Amnon Cohen said, but let's see what Richard W. Bullier said, a professor of history at Columbia University, in his book, The Case for the Islamo-Christian Civilization. He says, minutely studying case after case, they have shown that justice was generally meted out impartially, irrespective of religion, official status, gender. Not being subjected to the Shariah, Jews and Christians were free to go to their own religious authorities for adjudication of disputes, but in many cases, they went instead to the Qadi, the Islamic judge. So there's an indication here that in the past, as a result of the cohesive values of Islam, there was a strong justice system. But also, I believe that there is a deterrent mechanism as well in the Islamic social model, which are the suitably harsh punishments. And I would argue that societies do require suitably harsh punishments. And if you look at popular culture today, look at forums, you even look at the Sun newspaper, which in a way is intellectual blasphemy to refer to the Sun in presentations such as these, but nevertheless I think it's appropriate, that people are calling for things like capital punishment, for example. Now if we look at the works of the late professor at Fordham University, Ernest van der Haag, he basically says capital punishment or suitably harsh punishments is based on a common sense notion, which is what is feared most deters most. And he also argues that it should be on grounds of justice alone. He says, to me, the life of any innocent victim who might be spared has great value. The life of a convicted murderer does not. However, in the Islamic social model, it's seen as the last point. It's seen as a deterrent, because someone has to escape cohesive values. Then they have to escape those values being propagated in a society, and then they have to escape the mechanisms put in place in that society to prevent crime in the first place. So now you would appreciate that a suitably harsh punishment actually quite makes sense in this model. Because if you take the punishment outside of the model and put it into a liberal context, it's seen quite unjust. Because you can argue in the US there's death row, there's capital punishment, and statistics and studies have shown that they just don't work. But the issue is, in the US, the harsh punishment or the capital punishment sits on non-cohesive values. That is the point. So it breaks, it crumbles. Whereas in the Islamic model, it's based upon these strong layers, if you like, that one has to escape. Then the suitably harsh punishments are used as a deterrent. However, even in saying this, in the Islamic Sharia, to get these harsh punishments implemented, you have a very high standards of proof unknown in the liberal model. For example, Professor of Law at Harvard University, Noah Feldman, he states, today, when we evoke the harsh punishments prescribed by the Sharia for a handful of offenses, we rarely acknowledge the high standards of proof necessary for the implementation. And this directly links to another hadith of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam when he said, if a person has a way, for example an alibi or an excuse, let them go, for it is better for a judge to make a mistake in dismissing charges than in applying the punishment on an innocent. Now, let's look at some of the results of the Islamic social model. Because I believe in history, the Islamic social model was implemented at one point in contrast to contemporary so-called Muslim societies. We had cohesive values, they were propagated via the education, via the Friday khutbah, via the prayers, etc. And there was mechanisms in place to prevent those crimes, such as the Islamic economic model that wasn't based on a geopolitical myth of too much competition and created this huge collective conscience of I need, I want. And on top of that, you had suitably harsh punishments with an effective and unparalleled justice system. So let's look at some of the results of the Islamic social model. Kindness and liberty. The Qur'an says, "Let there be no compulsion in religion. Verily the right path has become distinct from the wrong path." The Qur'an also says, "What will explain to you what the steep path is? It is to free a slave, to feed at a time of hunger." And it continues and says, "To be one of those who urge one another to steadfastness and compassion." Now those are some key political values of Islam, and look what some historians had to say. Heinrich Graetz, a 19th century Jewish historian, expressed these political values and how they were implemented in Islamic Spain. He says, "It was in these favorable circumstances that the Spanish Jews came under the rule of the Mohammedans, as whose allies they esteemed themselves the equals of the co-religionists in Babylonia and Persia. They were kindly treated and obtained religious liberty, of which they had so long been deprived." Tolerance and popular rule. Reinhard Dozy, an authority on early Islamic Spain, he states, "The unbounded tolerance of the Arabs must also be taken into account. In religious matters, they put pressure on no man. Christians preferred their rule to that of the Franks." Ulrich R. Burke, a prominent historian specializing in the history of Spain, reached a similar conclusion. He says, "Christians did not suffer in any way on the account of their religion at the hands of the Moors. Not only perfect toleration, but nominal equality was the rule of the Arabs, i.e. the Muslims in Spain." Now these historical realities are directly as a result of the Qur'an itself, which is the verse I mentioned to you in the beginning. "O mankind, we created you from a single pair of female and female, and made you into nations and tribes that you may know each other, not that you may despise one another. Verily the most honored of you in the sight of God is the one who is the most righteous." Distribution of resources. As we discussed, the macroeconomy of the Islamic economic model is one that actually deals with the major economic problem of the 21st century, which is the distribution of resources. It says in the Qur'an, "Do good to the indigent till the economic imbalance is no more." It further states, "Feed the indigent without wishing any return from them, not even a word of thanks." And this is found in the famous letter of the Rabbi, which can be found in the book by Philip Mansell, Constantinople. He reflects the Quranic reality of distributing resources, not only for the Muslims, but for minorities such as the Jews. The Rabbi says in a primary source, "Here in the land of the Turks, we have nothing to complain of. We possess great fortune, much gold and silver is in our hands. We are not oppressed with heavy taxes, and our commerce is free and unhindered. Rich are the fruits of the earth. Everything is cheap, and every one of us lives in peace and freedom." I believe my discussion today, and there's many nods, and there's many, I don't know what these are called, there's many of those as well. And I think that's good, because we can have a very positive question and answers. So I think my discussion today can be summarized as follows. 1. Any system of law cannot be viewed in isolation from its values, political outlook, and its punishments. We have to have a holistic argument and nuanced discussion in the correct context. 2. Liberalism has failed Western society as its premise is force, i.e. individualism and atomism, and its non-cohesive values have caused social decay. 3. The liberal social model lacks a workable justice system, according to contemporary research on the matter, and it has inapplicable punishments that do not deter criminals. 4. Islam has a correct premise and its values, I believe, are cohesive. And 5, the Islamic social model has a workable justice system with suitably harsh punishments that act as a deterrent, which sit on top of the cohesive values and mechanisms in place to prevent the crime in the first instance, unlike the liberal social model, which I would argue facilitates crime, something which I believe I have substantiated in my presentation today. Apologies. I would argue that it is only via a sensible, nuanced discussion that we could discuss some of my claims or some of my attempts to substantiate my claims. And I would also strongly advise everyone in this room to think about today's presentation, because you do not get this information via the media. You do not get this information via certain political ideologues in our society. And unfortunately, you don't get this information via the mosques, which is a problem also. But I believe universities were built for one thing, and that thing was وَتَوَصَوْا بِالْحَقِّ, as the Qur'an says, to call for truth. And I think in this light we should proceed in the Q&A, because this discussion is something that creates a popular culture mentality. It shapes the collective mass in contemporary Britain. The last thing that everyone wants here is a non-cohesive society. The last thing that we all want are communities breaking away from each other. That's why I have deliberately and consciously spoken about the differences between the liberal model and the Islamic model. This is deliberate. Because why would I talk about things that bring us together? The common things, the common values. That's a given. We're going to unite on these things. We should not talk about them, because it's a human thing. We're going to unite on what is similar. But it's the differences that causes the anxiety. It's the differences that causes the fear. And it's the differences that cause the hatred. So why don't you demystify the differences? And I pray today was a small milestone in doing that. And I also pray that in the Q&A we'll be able to establish something sincerely. And I would entertain any question. And if I don't have the answers, I would say I don't have the answers. So no one should be afraid to ask. As I said in the beginning, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said, the cure to ignorance is to ask and learn. And in this light, I beg you we should proceed. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Unquestionably, indeed, all praises are due to God. And anything that I have said that is negative, wrong or offensive has come from my ego. And according to the Islamic spiritual tradition, it has come from Shaitan, Satan. Anything that is good, positive, cohesive has come from God Himself. Jazakallah for listening. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. My name's Alan Tripp. I'm at the university studying engineering, and I found the talk today was a little bit off message, in the sense that it didn't really fulfill the title it proclaimed to be talking about. First, it was generally an attack on a secular society with cherry-picked data. Some of it was worthy of Daily Mail, and perhaps you should apply for a column with them. There was a lack of counter data. You didn't quote any data from your own religious problems. You claim that all religions can claim community as a beneficial aspect. Your title, I should remind you, was Barbaric or Misunderstood. So you claim to wish to turn back to conservative values, which we've had here in this country before. You delicately passed around some of the more controversial aspects, I think, of Sharia law. And I think you should really tackle those. Certainly, if you're proposing we go back to conservative values, perhaps in this country, instead of, we should return to burning of witches, stool dunking, and hanging people for stealing. I see my friend here is holding his head in his hands, but basically, I found that you didn't really answer these questions of your title. Why do people see this Sharia law as barbaric? It is because it is too strong. It is too one-sided in that you will... it is too brutal. And it is going backwards. It is going back to a darker age, which we've left, thankfully. I would say the Islamic model has some benefits, of course, as all religious models do. But fundamentally, all religious models have one failure. They're unable to criticize themselves. They're able to criticize other people, other religions, but you're unable to criticize yourself. So I'd actually say your title should be, is Sharia law redundant, not misunderstood? So please...
Is that your question, sir?
Yes.
I didn't make the title, you have to take it with the organisers.
Well, that's one thing.
But I can address some of your...
Those were your comments. That's fair.
Comments.
You have your views and we respect that.
So
can I please
have a question?
Can I please ask you to make a question which is worthy of answering? Thank you.
Do you condemn then stoning to death of people for, say, adultery, for homosexuality? Do you condemn then people's hands being cut off for stealing?
Okay, thank you. Good question. Apart from the insults, what I'll do is go straight to your comments. First and foremost, I think I did answer the question on barbaric or misunderstood. Because in the beginning I set the context that via the media outlets, which you seem to have been heavily influenced by, we have a certain propagation of Islam and the Shariah, something backward, and hopefully I try to argue that the harsh punishments such as cutting the hand of the thief, which I will not condemn because this is part of what I believe in my own legal framework, something that I believe is divinely given as a Muslim. But I believe when we discuss the harsh punishments of the Sharia, we must argue them in the correct context. I think your comment is indicative of the need for more presentations such as this. Is because what you have done, you have superimposed liberal, Western, secular, whatever type of values on the Islamic narrative. That is problematic. And I think your comments, as well as some of your offensive statements, are indicative and exhibit this strongly. Therefore, I would disagree with you, but you have your right to opinion. I have answered the question because in order to understand any legal framework, and you're an engineer so you probably won't understand this, but lawyers will, that any legal framework must be understood in the context of values, society's values, political outlook, ideology, social model. This is how people legislate. They don't just pick things from the thin air. So hopefully by discussing in depth and using mostly Western commentators, so I don't know if you want to use, I can use Islamic heritage and what some of the Islamic scholars say, but that would be fundamentally biased. That's why I kept it in the Western narrative. Charles Taylor, Marilyn Friedman, Will Kimlicka, Professor Feldman. These are not Islamic names, and they're not desert romantics. They're not sitting under the sun and touching the sand. These are people that are academics. So I did go straight to the sources. And also, I think we need to call a spade, sir. Because you're saying that there's positive things in liberal society with regards to children, with regards to treatment of women, and economics and other factors that I mentioned today. I would agree with you. But I think there's a consensus opinion amongst popular culture discourse and academic discourse that there's a huge problem. And I think your attitude is actually part of the problem also, because you're not seeking for a solution. And the solution, I believe, is changing the fundamental values of a society. Something which in the past 30 years, the communitarian critique of political philosophy has been talking about for the past 30 years. These are anti-liberal Western philosophers saying that there's something wrong with liberalism. It can't fix these social problems because it wasn't meant to. If you look into the history, as I said, you're an engineer, so you probably won't understand this, but let me just elaborate a bit further. If you do look into the history of liberalism, you would understand that it came as a result of oppression of Catholic Church. the Middle Ages and medieval times. There was an oppression of thought. Anything incongruous with the Catholic tradition is a no-no, therefore we must suppress them. Hence you had the 30 Years' War and 80 Years' War, and that created the emotional environment for the likes of Locke and other thinkers to create the individualist view on human rights. But that to me was a reaction. It was a reaction just to make people tolerant. Because what they did, they took rights outside of God's will for society. But that was based upon the intolerance of the Catholic Church, not other ideological outlooks like Islam. So I'd argue, although it was necessary to have individualism at that time, and I agree, it was necessary because it solved a huge problem that the Catholic Church was oppressing the masses. But it doesn't mean it's right, because it was just a historical reaction and an accident. Also, you're saying you think Sharia law should be redundant. Again, that's your opinion. But I think I've given a cogent argument for the Sharia model. Cohesive values, those values are propagated, and they're not just conservative values. I'm not saying we should burn witches. This is a Christian narrative. Leviticus, the last witch was burnt in the 18th century. Islam never burnt anyone. So again, what you've done is showed why we need this conversation, because you're superimposing your particular historical baggage. What I mean by your is the European context, and saying that it must be applied generally to all religions. This is why we don't understand each other, because we have our own frame of reference and we like to superimpose it on everything else. For example, I work for the government, for the local council in one of the London boroughs. And many people there, they come from an Anglo-Saxon background, and they understand a certain history, religion, being intolerant, etc. And when they find things about Islam, they just don't believe it. All these academics, these Jews even, these minorities saying that Islam was tolerant, impossible. That's the problem, you see. We need to demystify this kind of narrative. And thank you for your comment, because it gives me the chance to expose that intellectual redundancy. Thank you very much.
Sorry. You would be allowed, but once we take other...
Actually, sorry, brother. He's right. Let me entertain the point that I forgot.
Okay, go ahead.
You're saying that we don't criticize our own tradition. There's a fundamental problem with the question, because what it does, it assumes that the person who has carried a certain belief or outlook is actually skeptical about their own belief and outlook. See, secular thought and liberal thought came as a result of skepticism generally. There may be many truths, or you cannot impose truths, so you cannot see truth as something that's sacred. The Islamic tradition doesn't have that historical baggage of a conflict between church and state. And therefore, there was always a truth that was intuitive almost, something that can be proven according to the Islamic intellectual tradition. However, criticism of law always existed for 1400 centuries according to his classical scholarship. Did God really say that? Did the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ mean this? When he meant about justice, did it mean this? What is the linguistic definition for justice? What's the intuitive definition for justice? What do we do when it comes to divorce and there's an issue of children? Who takes them? What if the wife gets married? Whose right is first? What about education? What about cutting the hand of the thief? What does hand mean? Is it from the elbow? Is it from the wrist? Do you see my point? Criticism and analysis of Islamic law has existed, and it will always exist. Just like in the liberal theory. But what I think liberalism, secularism, and Islam have in common is that we never, ever question the source of the law. Muslims will never question that God should be the source of the law. And liberals will never question that the human mind should be the source of the law. So in that way, we're as dogmatic as each other. And we have those assumptions, which is rightly so.
Thank you very much. Do I have any other questions? Yes? Sorry, can we have the mic at the front, please?
Thank you. My name is Irina. I come from Romania, so from a very different background. And before asking my question, I have to say that I have this question bearing in mind that we live in a transforming society nowadays, and I suppose everyone knows that societies tend to evolve in time. And my question is, I hope it's clear, my question for you would be, how do you think Islamic law and culture could be applied to today Western liberal society that you kind of criticized a little bit. So when I say beneficial way, I mean the reason why I say beneficial is that you kind of criticized, and what would be, in your opinion, the positive way of applying some Islamic laws and customs, or the way of thinking in Islam to Western society to make it better? Thank you.
Thank you. Very good question. Thank you very much. First and foremost, in fairness, I didn't only criticize liberal tradition. I think the liberals themselves criticized the liberal tradition. That's why I quoted the Western political philosophers to do that. So it's not only me saying it, but it was the works that I cited. If anyone has something different, has something very positive to say about individualism, please bring it to the table. But according to my research, individualism has actually failed society in a big way. How can Islamic law be applied in a liberal society? Well, that's the point of the discussion. It can't. Because both have alien values, political values generally. So they sit on two different frameworks, and you can't superimpose them on one another. What has to happen is Sharia law, if it were ever to be implemented, will be in a Muslim world. Because it has its prerequisites. Some of the values are still there. They're loosely connected. Some of the beliefs and practices are still there. And this can be reflected upon the major worldwide opinion polls from Maryland University and the Gallup polls, where over 74% of the Muslim world wanted Sharia law. Now from a Western perspective, people think, oh my God, hanging, stoning, cutting the hand of the thief. But that's a very small part of Sharia law. Sharia law has to do things with education, justice, economy, the economic system. I believe the Islamic economic system has something very positive to say, specifically in the context of the financial crisis, because it has a different, its geopolitics is different. Its premise for economy is different. It's based on distribution rather than competition. Because I would believe it's based on more of a realistic view on needs and resources, which has been substantiated with current statistics. So there's all these positive things. The Sharia is not just about that. And because the Sharia has to be implemented comprehensively, you can't implement it in piecemeal. You can't take a law outside of its framework. I'll give an example. A woman that's not married can generally get half of inheritance, or less inheritance rather. She can get less inheritance. Now if you just take that law outside of the context of the Sharia, the comprehensive model, it's unjust. I put my hand up first to say it's unjust. I agree if you put it into the liberal model. But when it sits in the Islamic framework, it's a different picture. That's why we need to understand it this way. Because the woman in the Islamic framework, she doesn't have to pay for her house. She doesn't have to pay for her food. She doesn't have to pay for her education. Actually, it's the right of others to pay for her food, education, clothing, even her makeup. Do you see? That's why you could argue they can get less inheritance. And if their husband or brothers or uncles or dads can't afford that maintenance and that responsibility and right that women have in an Islamic society, the government goes to the bank and gives the woman a house. Now in Britain, does Brown give the 90,000 homeless people a house? No. That's the problem, you see, because it's based on fundamentally different values. So that's how we should understand the Sharia. It's comprehensive. You cannot imply one alien heritage on another. It just doesn't make sense. It has to be applied comprehensively in its own right, just like it was in history.
Thank you very much. Do we have another question? Yes. Can we have the mic at the front here, please?
Hello. I have to admit quite a bit of ignorance with regard to Sharia law in Islam. But I agree with the previous speaker. There are benefits and good things that come from both Western religions and Islamic, religions. My question is more along the lines of the implementation, or actually the basis of your reasoning behind why Islamic law, why Sharia law works, and it all basically comes from social cohesion. In a situation like we have today, where you use the U.S. and the U.K. as prime examples, you have very heterogeneous societies. I would argue, from personal experience of living in Asia, specifically Japan, where you have a lower crime rate, it all draws from social cohesion. but it draws from a homogeneous society, a society that has a shared historical and philosophical background. And one of the reasons I think that you mentioned that the Muslim world, the majority wanted Sharia law, the implementation of Sharia law, is because they have that cohesion, they have that background, that shared belief. In a heterogeneous society like the UK and the US, I think you have to accept that you're going to have people with different values and different ideas. And in that sense, not necessarily that liberalism has failed, but that it accepts that people have different ideas and different values. In that sense, you have to have a different type of deterrent model beyond the specific deterrent model that perhaps cutting someone's handoff has. So in that sense, what I'm wondering again is, as far as how you would apply it, or what kind of suggestions you might have. Everyone can say that social cohesion and greater social cohesion is a remedy for the troubles of today. But if that's not possible based upon the lack of a shared social background or historical background, what kind of suggestions does Islam or does Islamic law or Sharia law have for a heterogeneous society?
It's a very good question, thank you. I would have to slightly differ. I believe USA and the UK, they have shared political values, because these are almost definitely propagated in liberal societies. Now, we have to be careful. What I mean by values is not only like, love one another, you want to be cohesive, you want to care. I'm actually arguing that what are in the most influential political structures in a certain society? What is the educational system saying? What are the politicians saying? What is the media saying? Now, when you look across the UK and Britain, generally, you have these shared type of core political values, which on the premise of them is individualism. If you were to hear Obama's speech, his inaugural speech, his address, you could take all those values and actually argue my case and say that all those values he was talking about was based upon individualist doctrine. Do you see the point? So I'm talking about the fundamental premise of a particular society, which can change very easily. If anyone understands about social constructionism, if you go to places like Tibet, you would think that they have the most compassionate viewpoint on life. They're Buddhists. Buddhist tradition is generally very compassionate. By the 1930s, there was reports that young babies will be immersed in freezing cold water. Some may die, some may not. We may think that's barbaric. According to their framework, it's not, because they're saying if it didn't survive now, it wouldn't survive the Himalayan winters. And if you look into the doctrine of karma, it makes sense to them. So when you say from that perspective, that idea has shaped people's behaviors. Just like in Britain 60 years ago, it was a very different Britain. And God knows what Britain's going to be like in 100 years' time. Because social norms and social values and political values can change if the influential structures start implementing them and challenging them, as I substantiate with the informational social influence and the normative social influence, that people do actually comply. So whether a society is heterogeneous or not, I believe that you're still going to have certain key political values anyway. And the ones that don't agree with those key political values, they're seen as alien to that society anyway. And you've been seeing this a lot in Britain, where some Muslims, they have their own political heritage to follow, and they want that implemented in the Muslim world. It doesn't mean they want to implement it in Britain, no, but they want to see Sharia in the Muslim world. Sharia doesn't mean this caricature of Sharia. There's a guy with a beard outside Sainsbury's, and there's a woman with a khimar and a jilbab with a sword inside. And there's some poor guy who wanted to steal a cookie because he's hungry, and he runs out. The guy with the beard trips him up, and the sister goes, Allahu Akbar, and cuts his hand. This is a caricature. This was painted in the media. And cartoons they don't always speak the truth, you see. So I would argue that what Islam tries to do is something similar. It tries to bring people to understand the Quranic model of values, justice, mercy, compassion, distribution, and make those priority. And we've seen that. That's why I deliberately quoted a lot of Jewish historians and Jewish statements. Samuel Usk, rabbis, David de Rossi, many others. If you go, Amnon Cohen's study was fascinating with 1,000 Jewish cases only across less than 100 years. And these people, the Jewish community, have their own specific heritage. That's very alien to many other people's way of life. That's why even in Britain, they have their rabbinical courts. And they go to them. In the Sharia, they had the rabbinical courts, but they didn't want to go to them. They went to the Sharia courts instead. So I think that says something positive about the Sharia courts and the way it tried to address the problem of getting different communities together. Because I think maybe one of the philosophical failings of secularism or liberalism, if you like, to unite people, is they didn't unite people on secularism. They didn't unite people on liberalism. They united them on nationalism. If you look into the history, the secular philosophers said, how are we going to unite people in a nation state? The nation itself. But the problem is, when you have people migrating, economic migrants, and they establish communities, then they don't feel part, because people, the secular philosophers, want to unite based on nation state. But someone from the Asian subcontinent, it's not really their nation, is it? They're here for a purpose, they want to live peacefully, but it's not their nation because they come from somewhere else. Or they have two homes. And that's why from the onset, I think, if I was a secularist and liberal, and someone who advocated liberalism hundreds of years ago, I would have said, we should unite people based upon ideas, not on the nation state. Because I think that's where you're getting the contemporary failings today.
So would you say then that what you need to do is not allow people with other ideas into your community, because then that breaks up the cohesion?
No, I'm not saying that.
Okay.
What I'm saying is you allow communities to exist, just like liberalism does and Sharia does. But every community, I'm saying, or every ideological outlook is going to propagate its values. It happens. And because people actually shape themselves to values they agree with, then that would naturally happen. And I'll argue some of the problems we see in liberal societies, because not everyone agrees with liberal values. But I would argue, which obviously I would, I'm sounding extremely biased here, but I would argue that some of the Quranic values are quite intuitive. Whether you're Muslim or not Muslim, they make sense, man. Distribution of wealth, justice, and stuff like that. So it is complex debate, but I don't really even have the answers. I just have musings. I'm just trying to scratch the surface just like you. But I think your question is very valid, and it's a very good question.
Thank you very much for that. I'd just like to read out some slip questions, because I have quite many here. This question is from Josh, National Black Students Committee, LGBT Rep. He goes on to say, in your speech you didn't mention gay lesbian community. According to Sharia law, we would get stoned to death. As far as Sharia law is concerned, homosexuality doesn't exist. Could you comment on that, please? Also, a cohesive society is all well and good, but what would you say for those who do not fit into this society and are thus not protected from the punishments by the cohesive values you discussed? An example of these are homosexuals. Please comment.
Yeah, we'll have to disagree here. In the Sharia, just like in many other religious traditions, that homosexuality is seen as a crime. That the public manifestation of homosexuality is seen as a crime, and it's seen as a sin in Islam. However, it doesn't mean that we all hate homosexuals. That doesn't make sense. My boss is homosexual. That's not the case at all. But what the Sharia does is it has its own social model, and it wants to protect its view for society. Just like liberalism, for example, wants to protect its foreign policy. That's why sometimes you have this term called liberal interventionism, and it goes and invades other countries based upon that premise. Now, Islam has a social framework, and its social framework is marriage, families, and it continues from there. Now, that's why homosexuality just doesn't fit in. And it's seen as a crime because one could argue that it seeks to protect its social framework. Why would any society would want to destroy its social framework? It just doesn't make sense. However, the claims that are being said that homosexuality is genetic or it's inherent, I think these are unfair claims. Well, it may be the case that homosexuality is genetic, but if anyone's a geneticist and actually reads about genetics, crime is linked to genetic behavior, to genetics. Many other behaviors are linked to genetics. Does that mean it's okay to be a paedophile? Of course not. We would disagree on that. Because people say that those kind of behaviors are linked to genetic, the sequence of proteins. So I think the naturalistic argument is a wrong one. I would argue that that's why Muslims still carry these kind of ideas. But it doesn't mean that we hate homosexuals. It doesn't mean that. As I say, my boss is homosexual. Rather, it means that the Islamic Sharia wants to protect its social framework. Personally, I don't think there's anything wrong with that, because it's logically consistent. Do you see? Whereas liberalism generally, because it doesn't have a social model, it doesn't have a vision for common good. That's how liberalism came about. Everyone should come up with their own truths. Do you see? That's liberalism for you. It came out of a situation of intolerance to have extreme tolerance. Do you see that point? So therefore, the politicians call it the common good for society. What is the good life? And that's where you have the communitarian critique from Charles Taylor, Will Plymouth and others. And they're saying, you know what? I think now we should start indicating to people what a good life is. Yeah, because something's wrong is happening. And it's just something that we just have to disagree on. Muslims obviously believe it's a sin because God said so. And if someone says, well, that's bigotry, I'll say, no, it's not, because we could prove that God said it. And that's another debate. Do you see? It's logically consistent. And I would argue that homosexual behavior can change. I know Muslims personally that were homosexuals and they changed to a heterosexual lifestyle. Personally, I know. They were my friends. They still are my friends. And I would also argue that Islam doesn't really say heterosexual behavior or homosexual behavior is natural. Because homosexuality is natural. Birds do it, primates do it. So logically, it's part of nature, right? So that's a nonsensical discussion. The way Islam uses it is that we have a drive, and that drive is we want love and we want to make love. The procreation instinct, as the psychologists and philosophers call it. Now, the Shariah says that instinct can be manifested within this scope. It's like this. Liberalism says the scope is like that. Do you see? So it's not an argument of someone's inherently bad or not. It's more of how you're going to manifest your certain instinctive inclinations. And yes, there is a punishment for it because it's a public crime. But no one can enter anyone's home. No one can spy. But I think we have bigger problems than this today anyway. This is not even a problem, I would argue. What the problems are, in my opinion, foreign policy and an unjust economic model that has basically been the biggest terrorist. You know, I would argue liberal economics and capitalism has been the biggest terrorist. That's killed millions and millions. If you look at the UNDP report, in 1997, I think around 20 million in 10 years, from 1997 to 2007, over 90 million African female babies died as a result of hunger. That's a bigger problem for me. So I hope I answered that question in a frank manner.
Thank you. Just before I take another question, I'd like to read another slip, and then after that we'll resume. This person goes on to say, shouldn't we look at the influence of Darwinist theory of survival of the fittest in liberalism, and how, as a result, this led to 180 million people in the 20th century before we say Islam is barbaric, when more people have died in the name of liberalism than Islam or Sharia law?
It's an interesting argument. I mean, I don't know much about Darwin's social theory or how it created the communist theory, as some people say, and therefore it viewed matter as something that had no value, just matter, and human beings are matter, they're no different from the chair that you're sitting on philosophically, therefore it's okay to sit with your own mother, or it's okay to go and kill 60 million people or 6 million Christians, as what happened under communist rule. I mean, yeah, that does happen. But it's an interesting question, but to be honest, I can't comment much on it because I don't know much about it. But I would agree with the latter part of the statement, which essentially says, under secularism and liberalism, more people have died. I would agree. I would almost agree on that. Secular politics has facilitated a lot of massacres. Although there have been religious wars, I agree, and they've been brutal and bloody. But if we just look at the history of the 20th and 21st century, it's been a nightmare. Absolutely, it's been a nightmare. Look what happened under communism. Look what happened in the contemporary wars of Iraq and Afghanistan. Look what happens because of liberal economics. It's dangerous stuff. I suggest everyone just goes and inquires about it themselves.
Thank you. Question? Can I ask the person to take the mic there, please, to the back?
You invited positive comments about individualism, and my question relates in particular to competitiveness. I can't really speak for anyone else, but competitiveness is pretty much the reason why I'm at university. And my question is this: if there's there's no room for competitiveness in the Shariah social model, what is it that encourages people to better themselves?
Very good question. No wonder this is a red brick university. I think your question is wrong. Individualism is not competitiveness. Competitiveness is a value. Individualism is also a value, and it creates other values. In the Sharia, we have competitiveness. The Qur'an says, compete for good deeds. That's not a problem. But it doesn't mean you have to do it in an individualistic way. It doesn't mean you have to be atomistic in your view on society or man, that you're dissociated from any social attachments. I would even argue your capacity to compete can only happen in a social context. So therefore, it argues my premise. Do you see? So individualism is not competitiveness. So you can have excessive competitiveness, which I would call benefit-driven mentality. For example, if myself and the gentleman at the front, our relationship was just based on a specific benefit, then that bond is a very weak bond. Because if the lady at the back had something better to offer, then forget my friend. And this is what happens with foreign policy. And we see this. One day someone's a friend, and the next day he becomes a terrorist. And we see this all around. So I would argue competitiveness is very good. It's actually a Quranic value. It says compete for good deeds. But essentially the major driving force for all actions for Muslims specifically, is the pleasure of God. That's how we act. Now, with regards to the Islamic society, Muslim and non-Muslim, it will be the common social norms and values in that society, which is doing good for one another, being compassionate, and competing in those things. But then I would argue again, the competitive drive is a capacity that only works in the social context. So you cannot be individualistic. Therefore, I think the question is wrong, because individualism doesn't mean competitiveness.
Thank you very much. Any further questions? Can I ask the mic to go there, please? Could you keep your hand raised so they can see?
I've got a comment first of all, and a question. My comment first of all is to one of the very first questions which was asked at the back by the gentleman doing engineering as to whether Islamic law implemented within this country, is it barbaric, is it redundant? And as one of the few lawyers in the room, don't all do at once, I think I should comment on that in terms of, is Islamic law already within the country? Yes, it already is. If you look at it from a financial perspective, last year the biggest sort of financial transaction that happened, which was buying out Aston Martin, British company, was done through what Islamic Sharia principles, because they were at that time the best principles to use both economically and because they were fair. Put that aside, that's commercial law. If you look at it from a family law perspective, at the moment a Muslim couple can go through a Muslim arbitration tribunal and have their decision decided then, according to Muslim principles, Islamic principles, and then go to an English High Court, and the English High Court judge will agree. So in some elements, it's already there, and we've got that same principle within the Muslim community as have the Jewish community. The Jewish community in London, to solve a dispute regarding their family, can go to the Beth Din, and they can have a dispute solved. And so we're not sort of asking or having anything that is slightly different to any other community. Even the Lord Chief Justice, who was about a year ago, Lord Phillips, agreed that principles of Sharia can be implemented within the English legal justice system. Perhaps not the cutting off of hands or the stoning for adultery. That's sort of separate, and they're the sort of extremes that the media will propagate to say actually no, it's wrong. But elements of it are already within the legal system. Even the Archbishop of Canterbury last year at his speech said actually yes, Islamic values can be used. And he's a man of the cloth of a different religion, but still the same values. So that's my sort of comment on that. And if you want any further information, it's an area that I deal with, so I can have a chat with you about it. My question to the friends. You talked previously sort of about the criminal justice system, of why, for example, some people like going back to prison, and you also talked about the death row system. I would say that, as somebody who practices within the field, the death row system, for example, is there and it doesn't work because the majority of people who end up on death row are from a black and minority ethnic community and are the poorest of the poor. They don't have the money to hire the attorney to defend themselves, and that's how they end up there. Criminal justice system, for example, although people think lawyers earn lots of money, some of them do, but criminal lawyers, and at least the reason why the justice system doesn't work is because a lot of the times your sort of most severe criminal cannot find a lawyer, as funny as it is, to defend them, because nobody will take it on. because there's just so much paperwork and the money that a lawyer will earn for it is not worth to take on. So my sort of question is, well, actually, is the problem not the values or the belief that the system is based upon, but actually funding, whether you look at the US death row system, whether you look at the criminal justice system within England. And if somebody, for example, new government came in next year and gave you the baton and said, actually, here you go, how would you physically, beliefs aside, actually change a system which actually lacks funding, and its funding is going to be lacking in another new area sort of coming up in the next year, which is family law, where all the funding is absolutely being cut. So previously, whatever religion, if you go to the court to get married or divorced or whatever, you could actually get legal aid from next year. A, you won't be able to find a lawyer to do it, and B, there won't be any funding within the system for you to actually do that. So that, again, non-cohesive societies, how would you physically change the system? Sorry,
Me personally, physically?
Physically, how would you change, with your beliefs that you've talked about today, how would you physically change that criminal justice system, whether it's US death, right?
Yeah, I mean,
or whether it's England?
yeah, I mean, I discussed it already. I wouldn't change it because, see, we shouldn't be reductionist in our approach. Just isolated to one thing like economic. I mean, to be honest, if a lot of these criminals had more money, does that mean they wouldn't be guilty? To be honest, sometimes it's to do with funding, and sometimes it has nothing to do with funding. If you look into the works of criminologists, it's to do with actually one, people, the values that people hold. If they're brought from an individualistic society, they don't care about their fellow man, basically. It's as simple as that. So it's values. Obviously, the criminal justice system is failing. If you look at Nick Davies' study, you could even Google it and look at it on The Guardian. It's got some damning statistics. Some of it is to do with funding, I agree, but I don't think funding will solve the problem. The only thing that funding would do is that you'd have more access to aid, legal aid, if you like, or legal representation. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to stop people doing crime. That doesn't make any sense at all. Sorry, I mean, I'm not trying to blow your argument, but I would argue that funding is important from an economic system point of view, because a lot of the crimes are done because people are poor. That I agree with. And that's why we need to fundamentally change, I believe, liberal economics. And I think Obama and Brown should be questioning actually the fundamental values of liberal economics, the free market, in this big jungle of economy, anything goes. There's no mechanism in place to ensure that there's a positive economic output. And this is what happens. In the past 100 years, you've had not just one financial crisis. This one has been exasperated by the media. We've had many. We had the dot-com crisis, we had the crisis in the 60s, 30s, and before. And I would argue that if an economic model always has to fix itself, or break its principles to fix itself. For example, America was telling China for years, don't do business. Chinese government, just don't do business. And now, the American government is doing business. It's actually putting nearly $1 trillion as an economic stimulus into the market. It's broken its liberal economic principles. The government doesn't get involved in economic, free market economy. But it's broken in principles in order to preserve them. I would argue there's something fundamentally wrong with the system itself. You have to break the rules to preserve them. So I would argue that, I would turn your question into one that maybe poverty is a facilitator for a lot of crime, such as Clive Cullen, the criminologist, was talking about. We need to look at the facilitating factors that evoke certain crimes. And that's my 10 pence worth on that question.
Thank you very much. Can I request that everybody try to keep their questions as brief as possible?
No party political broadcast.
Any further questions? Yes, the person at the back there.
You spoke about Islamic law in Islamic Spain and so like that. Do we have any contemporary examples of where Sharia law has been applied properly? Because surely we need these examples if we're going to apply it today in today's world. Because since that time, the world's changed completely. So, do they exist?
Okay, I'll address your last point first, which is since then the world has changed completely. I disagree. Human beings still have 2 legs, 2 arms. We still have the same instincts. Instincts haven't changed. So law comes for people who have certain drives. And I think because we haven't changed that way, the Sharia still applies. It's not a problem. And the second point is with regards to any contemporary examples of the Sharia. That's a hard one, to be honest. I would argue there isn't no comprehensive model of the Sharia implemented today.
How do we know it can work?
Well, the only way we could know it could work is one, from looking at its principles, looking at its political philosophy, and thirdly, looking at its application in 1,000 years, I would argue, in Islamic history, which I think is quite good. You look at its CV, it's got 1,000 years of some good stuff, yeah? Whereas liberalism is still yet to work itself out. It's only 300, 200 years old, you see. Whereas the Islamic model has had a tried and tested model for 1,000 years. So if you're conservative...
What Islamic model? You said yourself that there's not...
Well, the Islamic model that I've just given, based upon its principles from its source text of the Qur'an and the Hadith and the Sunnah, which is the Hadith, the narrations of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they were applied in history, that's my point. So if they were applied in history and they created some good positive results, which I quoted some Jewish, non-Jewish historians related to economy, kindness, distribution of resources, then surely that's a good thing. There's a good CV there. Now, if you look at some contemporary examples, the best thing I can argue now is about the Sharia model for finance. Although it's not 100% in my opinion Sharia, but its principles are there, and as a result of the financial crisis, most of the Sharia financial institutions have not suffered. So that's my only way of looking at the contemporary example. But as I said, the Sharia must be implemented comprehensively. If you don't, you get disastrous results, which I believe you see in places like Saudi Arabia and Iran.
Thank you. Any further questions? Question there.
Hi, thanks. I've got a couple of things. They're kind of questions, comments, just to feed into the discussion. When you were talking about poverty, you said that there's enough resources to go around, which I agree with, but I think poverty is more than just water, food, shelter. I think it's stuff to do with opportunity and ambition, and I think that capitalism allows people to experience their own enterprise and creativity. I think there's an aspect of that that needs to be appreciated. And the other thing that I found myself throughout the talk, when you were talking about distribution of wealth, and recently in one of the last comments, capacity to compete, which I think is an important thing to me. And I thought to myself, why am I agreeing with you? And I'm like, oh, a lot of this actually sort of reminds me of my Labour Party membership card, which I'll allow you to do now. But yeah, some of it does. And I think there's a discussion that hasn't taken place where we're talking about liberalism versus the Islamic model. We haven't talked about progressive government versus conservative. And I actually think when you say, is there any practicing working model of the Islamic social model, that's because it's a progressive format socially. And then, things fail and you have to improve on them. But my concern is that although I can come here today and intellectually debate this with you, there are some things that aren't open for intellectual debate, and that's the fact that I'm gay, and that, being described next to a paedophile isn't really what I came here today for. But also stuff to do with gender and things like that, like friends of mine who are trans couldn't come here because they wouldn't know what door to go in. Do you know what I mean? And it concerns me that some things just aren't there to be discussed.
Yes, very bravery. I would applaud the lady at the back for her bravery. I didn't actually say that gays are equivalent to paedophiles. I didn't mean it that way. What I meant to say is, using the genetic argument is actually not really an argument. That was my point. Even people who study genetics would even claim that and then say, well, if you apply that to everything else, then we can justify everything, even things like paedophilia. That was my point. So it is up for discussion. I mean, I think I gave a cogent argument why Islam seeks to protect its social model. And it just happens that the homosexual practice lies outside of that model. Just like in liberal society, it does have its scope as well. It will not allow, for example, older men to marry younger boys. That just doesn't happen. But I would say liberal societies don't know how to draw the line. Because there's a society called NAMBLA, which is the North American Men, Boys, Lovers Association. And it's in Belgium. And they're using the UN regime of human rights to actually implement the right of a small young boy to sleep with an old man. I think that's a problem. Who draws the line? And God knows what would happen in 50 or 60 years if the social norms change. So that was my argument. Who draws the line and where? You talked about capitalism creates opportunity. Yeah, you're right, it does. But I would argue that the Islamic model does exactly the same as well. But what it does, it just goes straight to the economic problem that all societies face, which is distribution of resources. Then you talked about liberalism and progressive government versus a conservative government. I would argue that the Sharia doesn't exist not because people wanted progressive governments. The Sharia doesn't exist anymore not because it failed, it actually worked. That's the problem. It worked for 1,000 years, if not more, a little less. It did actually work. The problem is, it was removed. If you look into history, there was an ideological struggle. One can say it was imperialistic colonialist powers and the Islamic East. And if we look into, post-20th century, you would see some of key political milestones that indicate what I'm trying to say, that there was actually an effort to remove the Islamic social model, Islamic governance from the Muslim world. And you see that in varying statements of many politicians. So I would argue that it didn't fail. It worked. And because it was progressive, because there's a process called ijtihad, which basically, linguistically means to work hard on something. And what it is when there's a new reality, for example, maybe the issue of transgender, or someone who's born a man but wants to be a woman. Now, the Qur'an and the Hadith, they don't really have answers for that directly. But the process of ijtihad, which is sanctioned by those texts, the Qur'an and the Hadith, says when new reality comes, basically, exert your effort to derive principles to apply to this new reality. It's not a problem. So for me, Islam is very progressive that way, because it has the capacity and the mechanisms to deal with modern problems. So I think it wasn't because it failed, it was actually because I believe it was destroyed effectively. Sorry, come back please.
I think trans issues are a little bit more than transgender, because I think actually that's a really good example. In some places, Islamic societies, it is legal to change your sex, but I think it's more, is there intellectual space to discuss the divide of being one or the other? But the other thing I forgot to say the first time, what was it? Hang on, I've got loads going on. I think it's interesting when people use the term like that homosexuality doesn't fit in with the family structure, and I think using the term family is really it's difficult because people use it to justify a lot of different kind of structures, if you know what I mean. Like if you turn on the news, you'll hear David Cameron going on about the family all the time, and that's to justify just taking care of you, your own, that's it. Do you know what I mean?
That's a very good point. Look, let's call a spade a spade. Homosexuals are human beings that have emotions and feelings and have the capacity to love one another. I'm not going to disagree with that. And what I meant by family structure, I meant Islam has a social framework. And that social framework has some dictates which say that relations has to be in the context of marriage between a male and a female. That's its scope. Anything outside of that scope is seen as criminal, a public manifestation of it. Yeah? So that's what I meant by family. So to have an intellectual space for discussion, we're having that today, for example. But in many societies, including a liberal society or secular society, sometimes there is no discussion if people really believe something's a crime. You see, who's going to argue that theft is not wrong from a liberal perspective? Who's going to argue murder is not murder? You see, I'm not trying to... See, it's a motive discussion because the way I'm coming across is like I'm calling you a criminal from the Islamic perspective. But we have to seek and trying to understand each heritage for what it's trying to say. The last thing you would want from me is to be insincere and intellectually unjust. And say, Islam, you can marry a man if you're a man, you can marry a woman if you're a woman, it's not a problem. You see, that would be intellectually unjust if I don't really believe in it, and secondly, I have no justification for my source text, which is the Qur'an and the Hadith. So sometimes we just have to agree to disagree on this issue. And at least you understood the relevancy of what I'm talking about, because it's based upon a model and it's based upon an intellectual basis. Whether you agree with it or not, it's still based on something solid. At least we could come to that conclusion. And I think that's what we have to take it. But thank you very much for your questions.
Thank you. Just before I take another question, I'd like to read out something from the slip. This person goes on to say, from an economic perspective, neoliberal economists, particularly after the Second World War, would argue that economic booms have been reliant upon the scarcity of resources and distribution of wealth. Advantages can be seen, for example, in creation of the NHS and increase in the general standard of living. So my question is, what key policies issues would Sharia law address with regards to economics?
It's a loaded question. Could be here all day on the economic system of Islam. Okay, first and foremost, we have a macroeconomy in Islam, which is based upon the hadith I mentioned previously of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he said that every human being has a right to food, shelter, and clothing. So that doesn't create a competitive philosophy, it creates one of distribution. And that distribution is heavily reliant on certain mechanisms to distribute wealth. One of those mechanisms is the prohibition of interest. In the Islamic model, interest is prohibited. Now, one can argue because that is detrimental to the circulation of wealth. For example, if you were to buy a house for £200,000 and you're paying £400,000 because of the interest, that excess money could have been in the pockets of society or the individual. Now, one would argue, well, they could just keep it for themselves. No, because stagnant money in Islam, that's not moving, that's not used, is actually taxed 2.5%. So there's an economic stimulus to take your money and actually engage in entrepreneurship and businesses. Because why would your money want to be decreasing 2.5% every year? It just doesn't make sense. Instinctively, it doesn't make sense. So people would use that excess money or residual income, if you like, and inject it in society. And I think this is a very good financial model. And also, you have very small taxation. So you tax people less, which means more money in the hands of society. 2.5% flat rate tax compared to the American tax of 40%, and that's just direct tax. Furthermore, you have the prohibition of monopolies. It's not free market economics, and it's not too strict, if you like, and trying to manage every single economic activity. Rather, it's got a mechanism in place to prevent monopolies, and therefore preventing competition and quality of goods. And that's a Quranic injunction when the Qur'an says, so the wealth does not become a commodity just amongst the rich. And that injunction is used from an Islamic government to get involved in a market economy to ensure that there are no monopolies. So these are just basic fundamental principles based on the Qur'an and the Hadith that show that there's a cogent case for a unique model based on distribution of resources and the circulation of wealth. What's more interesting is what's happening in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, if you were to give the money made of oil from the oil barrels in Saudi Arabia to every single person in Saudi, some people say every single person would earn £30,000 a year. And there's a hadith, there's an injunction from the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ himself when he said the people have the rights to natural resources. So the government only owns the natural resources on behalf of the people. So the profits made go straight to the people. But unlike in Saudi Arabia, it goes straight to the elite princes. But if that model, if the Islamic model was actually used, Saudi Arabian people, or the citizens of Saudi Arabia, will never have to work again. Do you see my point? So I think it's a very cogent case for a very unique Islamic model. And there are other things, for example, it's not based on gambling or derivatives, and it's got very stable inflation. This is very important. Very stable inflation because it doesn't allow banks just to print the money. It's the bank has to print the money. And when it does print money, it has to be based on something substantial like gold or silver. So when you've got more money in society, it means you've got more wealth. Whereas in the liberal economics, when you have more money, it doesn't mean you have more wealth because of inflation. And stable inflation has been recorded in Islamic history. In the 16th century, within an 80-year period, inflation was only 7% after 80 years. It's 7% after 2 or 3 years. in capitalist countries. And that's because I would argue the money that's printed is based on something substantial, such as the gold and silver standard. So there's many other aspects to Islamic economics that many probably never known before. But I think that's something that is good for discussion because we're living in the climate of financial crisis, financial breakdown, whatever you want to call it. And I think Islam has a very positive and cogent case in order to achieve that. Even historians during the Uthmani Khilafah, the Ottoman state or the Ottoman Empire, many Western historians are saying that for the first time there was no relative poverty, if you like. Everyone had food, shelter and clothing. Because even when you go into the mosques, if you go to some of the mosques in Turkey, there's this big marble dome-like structures with holes in it. And when I went to travel, I asked one of the representatives, what is this? He says, basically, when people walked in, if they were rich, they could put their hand and leave money. And when people were poor, they could go and take money. So money was always there if people needed it, you see. I mean, it's a very interesting model. So I hope that answered the question.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to read out a quick slip, and then we can take another question. Islamic social model, the claim is it is perfect. However, there's a divide, the Shia-Sunni divide, i.e. the Protestant-Catholic divide in terms of Christianity. Muslims fight and die as they did to do in other religions. So what do you have to say about that?
The Shias have a very similar model. It's called Wilayatul Faqih. They have a very similar outlook, and they have very similar principles. Thank you very much, Jazakallah. They have very similar principles with regards to economics, etc. However, I would argue sectarian violence has nothing to do with Islam. It's actually being exasperated by the war. If you take Iraq as an example, although Shia and Sunni are fighting, it only happened as a result of the invasion. People didn't even know who was Sunni or who was Shia before. There was even inter-religious marriages. But my theological position on the Shia tradition is that I believe it's incongruous with the Islamic position. But that's another discussion. But even if you take it just from an academic, intellectual perspective, they do have very similar principles.
Question at the back there. Can I ask you to take the mic there, and then after that we'll move back onto the ladies' side.
This question relates to capital punishment. It's the age-old question, really. Given that miscarriages of justice are inevitable even in the best criminal justice systems, would you say that under Islamic law, the sacrifice of a few innocent people is worth the deterrent effects of capital punishment?
Well, the thing with capital punishment, it's really used. I mean, even with things like, because then we have the thief or stoning the adulterer, in 1400 years it was only done like 11 or 14 times. And that's because of the social model. There was cohesive values, mechanisms in place to prevent the crime in the first place. And if someone was supposedly to get caught, there's very hard and strict methods in place, and the onus of proof and the burden of proof and what establishes proof. For example, the Islamic model doesn't really agree with the term beyond reasonable doubt. It actually says you have to have 100% conviction that this person actually did the crime. So when it comes to adultery, 4 witnesses that are not related in some cases, according to different traditions, that are pious, that have never committed criminal acts, that are seen as to be trustworthy, must have seen the act in public. You must see, and excuse me for my imaginistic expressions, you must see the male organ inserted into the female organ in public. You don't even see that in liberal societies. So the point is, one may argue, what if they see it in someone's home? Well, the thing is, if you look into someone's house in Islamic society, that's seen as a sin. And therefore you're not a valid witness anymore. So that's how strict the laws are put in place. So it's none of this caricature of everyone wants to be stoned. This is ridiculous. Even in the Shariah, when we have an indication from the hadith, the very narrations, if people did commit such acts and they didn't get caught, and it hasn't gone to the judge or the qadi or one responsible, then they should keep shut, they should be quiet. That's the indication in the hadith there. Although from the Islamic spiritual perspective, getting punishment in this life is much better than the hereafter. But we believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most forgiving. He forgives all sins apart from the active shirk, which basically means attributing partners or associates to Allah or to God. So with regards to capital punishment, I would maybe agree, in the liberal model, yeah, it can be a bit unfair, but in an alternative model that has even a more strict criteria, based on all these mechanisms and all these layers, if you like, and then I would argue that no, it is worth it. Because in Islam, we see it as a deterrent that saves many, many, many lives.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Question on the ladies' side.
So the first more random go ahead, yeah. What I wanted to ask and basically comment on, when you said that there is no place on earth when Sharia law is really working. What I see, and I don't want to offend any Muslims or anything like that, because I'm not married to a Muslim man, but why Muslims are coming to liberal countries, and millions of them are escaping Afghanistan, Iran, Pakistan, etc., to live in liberal societies, if they believe that their law is better than liberal. I find it a bit hypocritical, because I'm a migrant in this country as well, but if I live in this country, I respect their values, and I don't try to say that mine are better because I've chosen this country over mine, so that means there's something wrong with mine, I would say.
I disagree. Why would your values be, why can't you talk about your values? I mean, what is it? Do we live in some form of Catholic oppressive state that you can't talk about other traditions? This is the whole point of living in a contemporary society, that you could have this debate. And also, basically, I'm not a migrant. I was born here. I'm a British citizen. I'm British. So by definition, my values are probably British values also. And that would give you a challenge. And I'm probably better placed to understand this than you, because I've travelled the whole of Britain giving lectures left, right and centre. And people don't have common values. They have common key political values of individualism and individual rights. But what we say in popular culture, values of compassion, mercy, how we treat others, people differ. So what do we mean by values? First and foremost, let's define what British values means in the first place. Go to Scotland, he might even consider himself a Brit. You don't know. If you go somewhere in Wales or you go anywhere, it's totally different. It's not, homogeneous that way. So, and I also would argue that people come to this country not because they're fleeing Sharia. They're actually fleeing oppressive dictatorships that are supported by the West, I hasten to add, in the first place. So, they're not fleeing the Sharia. These people actually want the Sharia. That's why their kids grow up wanting the Sharia. You see, they're fleeing economic chaos. So they're economic migrants, aren't they? They're only hoping for the Sharia. I mean, even if you see in many places like throughout the world, from Jordan to North Africa, the polls, and most polls were actually done by women also, that they want aspects of Sharia law, they want Sharia law implemented, over 74% of them. So I don't think it's because they don't like their own countries, or they don't like the term, or the notion, or the implementation of Sharia. Rather, they're economic migrants. They live in oppressive regimes. Do you know what Egypt does to its political opponents? It tortures them. Do you know what Syria does to its political opponents? It tortures them. Do you know what Central Asia does to its political opponents? It injects them with the AIDS virus. It removes the fingernails off. It boils its political opponents. Go to Amnesty International. No wonder they're running away. They're running away because they're in dictatorships, not because they're living under the Sharia. And they're running away because a lot of them want to shout at our government, because our government has been, I would argue, via proxy, supporting these regimes. It was only Britain and America supporting Uzbekistan, supporting Islam Karimov. And he is like an oppressive dictator. I mean, surely. And it's a good question, but language like that is very similar to the language of the BNP. Because the BNP say this: if you don't like it, get out. I was born here, mate. My granddad fought for the British. What did your granddad do? Do you see my point? And my other granddad, he used to make the upholstery for the British arms in Cyprus. My mum's from Cyprus, my dad's from Greece, and my other granddad, the Greek one, he fought against the Germans. I mean, this is a nonsense. This question doesn't make any sense. I'm probably more British than any Anglo-Saxon, because my family have fought hard, you see, for so-called British initiatives. So
Sorry. So how can you now negate all the British, well, political system and everything if you say that your family fought for that?
No, but the point is, I'm allowed to disagree with the British system. And secondly, going to the Houses of Parliament, they disagree with each other all the time. Does that mean Brown doesn't like Britain because he's arguing with Cameron? Or does it mean Cameron doesn't like Britain because he's arguing with Brown? This doesn't make sense. You mean everyone who comes in as a British citizen that came from a different heritage, they must just shut up and never challenge anything that they think is wrong? Come on. I mean, I do understand where you're coming from, but I think you're just a victim of the media, to be honest. Honestly, I think you're a victim of this popular culture that thinks it's the British way or no way, and they define what British is. I would challenge everyone, if you have enough paper, everyone to write 4 points what they think British is. I would almost guarantee, and if I'm wrong, I'll walk home from London, yeah? That everyone would disagree. And that's why this whole conversation even belittles the Contest 2 strategy that was published yesterday. So, I mean, I disagree with your question. But thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Any further questions? We have one question at the back there.
While I sort of agree with the libertarian aspect of the Islamic financial model, for example, low taxation, I think it's completely unworkable in the real world because you mentioned Saudi Arabia, but Saudi Arabia, the government is propped up by the USA. So if they initiated a law whereby the people of Saudi Arabia would get an equal cut in the oil produce, then the USA would just walk in and topple the regime and put in place another one. So I mean, the Sharia law, the Islamic financial model or Sharia law doesn't really preempt this. So I mean, as well as the fact that you said that it guarantees a cut in the natural resources, but no country has equal amounts of resources. So I mean, there's going to be conflicts anyway.
I mean, I would argue, my example was just using Saudi Arabia as an example that if the principle was put in place, people will get, say, $30,000 a year as a result of what is theirs, which is the oil. I'm not saying that Saudi Arabia would do that now, because that would probably create World War III. And plus, I believe the Saudi government are cowards anyway. So I wasn't saying that Saudi Arabia should do that. They have a lot of things that they need to upturn and revive. That's not the issue. I was just using it as a specific example to show that it's such a beautiful economic principle which is based directly on the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, that the natural resources are the people's, and the government only has a delegated responsibility to ensure that is given back to the people, which doesn't happen. I'm saying if it did happen, then it would be positive. But I agree with your point that America would probably create a war, and I do sense anarchist undertones in your question.
No, I'm a conservative, to be honest. Right.
Okay, cool. I think conservative American style or British style?
British style.
That's good. Conservative is quite interesting. I should be reading about it. It's like history counts. David Hume, you reading about David Hume?
I've read about it.
Yeah, basically experience counts, so don't reinvent the wheel. So I would argue, if you're conservative, you should be calling for Sharia, because it worked for history for 1,000 years. So don't reinvent the wheel.
I just think it's workable, but without the religious undertones of it. I mean, libertarianism is a feasible idea. I think it's still an ideology that's got utopian sort of,
Sure.
But at the end of the day, I just think there needn't be any sort of religious connotations in a fight.
That's another good point, but the Sharia doesn't address religious needs, it addresses human needs. So the economics is for Muslim and non-Muslim. Justice for Muslim and non-Muslim, which is unlike other religious traditions where it's specifically for Christians or specifically for certain religious peoples. See, the Sharia came as a model for the whole of humanity, and we've seen that in history where Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians and Muslims, they live very peacefully and happily together. And even if we look at the Palestinian problem at the moment, when we have two factions fighting against each other. I mean, no one has ever talked about the solution that worked for hundreds and hundreds of years, which was the Islamic solution. That even Jews and Muslims and Christians live peacefully underneath that model. I don't know, why are we putting that model on the table?
Well, the thing is, it doesn't take into account that other ideologies will affect the Islamic fundamental utopian vision.
But that's a good point.
It doesn't allow for
sure.
this sort of...
Yeah, but the point is, well, then you could argue with libertarianism or liberalism or any other ism that they wouldn't basically allow another ideology to come into play, because ideologies by their nature seek to protect themselves, and the way they do that is they propagate their ideology. So liberalism, for example, would never allow for an illiberal ideology to take its place. Just like Islam would try and protect itself to not allow another ideology to take its place. That's why we have the notion of foreign policy. Why did foreign policy come about? To protect key political values.
Well, I disagree on that point, because liberalism per se didn't launch an American empire. It was realist state policy of ever-expanding government. So, I mean, my sort of...
I disagree with that.
No, I think...
If we read academics on liberalism, Professor Emeritus John Sharvey, in his book, The Liberal Project and Human Rights, it's almost sick if you read between the lines, and he's a very key academic at the London School of Economics. It just published in 2008, and he's saying basically, liberalism has a worldview. It wants to implement that worldview, and sometimes we've been naughty, and we've used violence to establish that worldview. But now is the time to use the UN as a regime on human rights to implement our liberal values and ideas. And sometimes it happens to be war. That's the nature of foreign policy.
I completely disagree. It's not liberalism. It's realist state policy. They're going under the guise of liberalism because we're a liberalised population and need justification to go to war. It's not liberalism. It's politicians, self-seeking politicians.
Okay, I'll ask you a question. Under the liberal model, under liberalism, would liberalism allow for liberalism not to exist anymore?
Well, the nature of liberalism is that it encompasses many aspects of. Fundamentally, I understand your point, which is that there is. Once you shift from liberalism, that's it. Liberalism is no more. But the point is that liberalism allows for the diversity. What I'm saying with foreign policy is that it doesn't matter if it's liberalism, communism, Islamic law. Every government is going to self-perpetuate, and that's just the way.
I see what you're saying, but I would argue that it's because of the liberal premise of individualism, because it resonates in the political arena. That's why you always hear US and UK politicians say, what is in our interests? What is in British interests? What is in USA interests? Which doesn't mean the people, it means the corporate elite in many times. So when it comes to Palestine, they never hardly said anything about the fetish killing of small Palestinian babies, because it wasn't in UK corporate elite interests or British interests or USA interests. That's why individualism, if translated on the foreign policy perspective, almost becomes a sick fetish of killing anyone just because of your interests. And I think that's the problem with the premise of liberalism, which is individualism.
Thank you. Can I have the next question? Question there. We'll take the last two questions, and after that we will close the proceedings.
We have a lot of differences in opinion in Islam. We have loads of different scholars saying this is right, that's right, this is how you interpret the Qur'an, this is how you interpret the Sunnah. So my question is, how do we know what the real Sharia is? Thank you.
I think it's fantastic to have differences of opinion. In Sharia it's called ikhtilaf, differences or contradictions in opinion. What there is no difference of opinion on is the source of the Sharia, which is the Qur'an and the Hadith. What is not differed amongst the scholars is that we do need to implement Sharia. And Sharia has an economic model, has a social model, and the basic fundamental pillars of these models, there is no disagreement on. The disagreements are based upon maybe policy, legislative changes. Just like in liberalism, that's why you have political parties. Labour may disagree, Conservatives may disagree, but they all have the same ideological basis. So that's not a problem. It's actually quite rich and fulfilling to have differences of opinion in any society, because it encourages reviving certain thoughts that maybe haven't been looked at, or scratching the intellectual surface a bit more further. But the difference of opinion is nothing creedal, or nothing ideological. Rather, it's more of the fruits and the sub-fruits Just like what happens in any liberal society, you have the Conservatives disagreeing with Labour, but they'll never disagree on the fundamental core political values.
Thank you. Any further questions? Question there. Could you please keep your hand raised?
I think it's unfair to say. He's gone left. I think it's unfair to say that just because we're asking for Sharia law, that we want it our way. By us being in this country, we want good for this country, and what we know is best is Sharia law, and we're putting on the table. It's not good enough to criticise the system and not offer any solutions. And what the speaker's saying here is Sharia offers those solutions. If you look at the social problems, just look at watch Jeremy Carr show and you'll see what's wrong with society. 19-year-old girls coming on TV and they don't know who the father is, taking lie detector tests. And then you have Jeremy Carr, who's a fornicator himself, commit adultery, and he's slamming these people and criticising them. So if Islam simply states premarital sex is forbidden, adultery is forbidden, then you wouldn't have these problems. And by us putting it on the table, then you can understand the benefit of it, and that's what he's trying to say. And it's not a barbaric system if it gives the children the right to know who their father is, because every child deserves to know who his father is. And you look at the crimes in this country, go to the prisons, half these people don't know who their fathers are. So Islam offers the solutions, and I think that one of my question would be, how could we implement some forms of Sharia law into the UK system, be it family law or commercial law, or in terms of commercial law that's already been done?
Well, I mean, from a technical perspective, I refer you to my right honourable sister. She's the expert in the Islamic family law and its implementation in the liberal framework. But I could only give you an ideological answer, which basically says that I believe in order to have a true Islamic model, it has to be implemented in its entirety. And I would say that can't happen in Britain, but that can happen in the Muslim world. Was that the last question?
This would be the last question. Any more questions? This brother.
She's had her hand up for longer, by the way.
Yeah.
Oh,
We need to be just, even if it's against our terms.
sorry.
Yeah, you go.
The person has volunteered for you to speak rather than himself. That's okay if you can ask a question.
Well, I was wondering about, instead of implementing Sharia law, not just in the UK, I was wondering about, assuming if the system is correct, as you're saying, why not implement it in the Islamic world? And well, my question is, what are the main objectives to the Sharia law in these countries, and how we can overcome them?
You mean the obstacles?
Obstacles.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it would be very positive to the American hegemony and for the rest of the world for Sharia law to be implemented in the Muslim world. It would create that balance of power, if you like. There's not a one nation dominating all. I mean, that's an ideological context, but I also argue that Sharia law, if it doesn't implement in its correct sense, would be a light for the rest of the world, I would argue. It would create something positive. Just like it was in the Middle Ages, where you had the scientists and the thinkers developing the arts and the sciences and the maths, if you like, the mathematical models, and the philosophy and reviving the Greek philosophies. Whereas during the Catholic period, it was not doing that. So at that time it was a light, and maybe it can be a light again today. Just like in the words of Adam Smith. Who's heard of Adam Smith? If anyone has a £20 note, you could basically find it on the back of your £20 note. He's apparently the modern founder of liberal economics, if you like. And this is what he had to say about Sharia law. And it's in our leaflet. I myself is from an institute called the Hittin Institute, which you can find more information on the website from here. And what he said was the following. He says, the empire of the caliphs, i.e. the Khilafah or Islamic governance, Sharia law, seems to have been the first state under which the world enjoyed that degree of tranquility which the cultivation of the sciences requires. It was under the protection of those generous and magnificent princes that the ancient philosophy and astronomy of the Greeks were restored and established in the East. That tranquility which the mild, just and religious government diffused of the vast empire revived the curiosity of mankind to inquire into the connecting principles of nature. This was Adam Smith talking about the Shariah. So I think it's very positive and it should be implemented in the Muslim world. But there's obstacles in the Muslim world, and those obstacles are actually the rulers today. And I believe under the theological or political banner of commanding the ma'ruf, forbidding the munkar, commanding the good and forbidding the evil, which is an Islamic principle, there needs to be a mass accountability of our rulers. There should be a form of revival to say these people are actually unjust, the dictators and the despots. And frankly, they need to be removed with more sincere leadership. And I think that's the problem of the Muslim world at the moment, is that there is no sincere leadership that actually refers to its own heritage. Now, obstacles of implementing Sharia in Britain, well, I would argue the obstacles are the influential structures in the society. They don't even know what Sharia is or what Islam is. So the prerequisites for an Islamic society are not there. So that's why many people would advocate and argue that we should implement the Sharia in the Muslim world because the prerequisites are there. And if that's the last question, I would like to take this opportunity just to thank everyone, and myself personally, for the very enlightening questions. And I think we've had a very frank and honest discussion. I've done this many times. I went to Oxford University, Cambridge, and I got to admit Birmingham was one of the best. So it was very frank, it was very honest and open, and obviously very brave as well. So I think the people that should be applauded is yourselves. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for attending. I'd like to congratulate the Ethnic Minorities Officer, Yasmin Patel, for putting all this together. Also the University of Birmingham Islamic Society, and last but not least, for all you in attending and engaging in intellectual debate and trying to dispel myths. Thank you very much.